recent release of the 3-part BBC documentary from Adam Curtis, most known for his release of Hypernormalization a few years ago that made quite a big splash. Today we're going to be talking about his new work that, what's the title of it again? It's can't get you out of my mind, and so it follows a lot of the same stylistic approaches and content that you'll be familiar with if you kind of have seen Hypernormalization or any of Adam Curtis's other work. But the main kind of plot here that is distinct is that we're offered a set of vignettes and stories from individual people's lives across the last, I would say, 60 to 70 years. And what Adam Curtis is really going for is a emotional, personal history of what, historic individuals felt about what was happening during the rise of neoliberalism, the beginning of the age of self, the collapse of the British Empire, and the rise of big tech and consumer culture. So I think it's a very ambitious film. I think after finishing the 4.5 hours that it amounts to, I was definitely left with a feeling of just a cacophony of different perspectives on how we've gotten to the modern world, and was impressed by the breadth of different international contexts that Curtis attempts to bring into it. He tries to weave a story that includes the post-colonial world, the rise of the People's Republic of China, developments in Thatcher's United Kingdom, and the birth of Silicon Valley, amongst a lot of other things. So yeah, it's definitely an ambitious work, and something that, as it was produced by the BBC, felt very radical to me. And I think harkened back to a feeling that I've had a few times with this critique of modern day culture, where everyone's in their own content bubble, and this yearning for people to have a shared sense of reality and the struggles with that. The idea that this was put forward on public broadcasting and is something that, I don't think it has an incredibly wide reach, but I think it's something that at least a lot of people are talking about. And I think it is a good kind of central piece for people to be having discussions oriented around, even though I don't think it's without its faults. So yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think?
It's sort of the ultimate COVID flick, really, because it's told almost entirely through like archival footage, like mostly BBC interviews, which they like classic BBC interviews, and then they follow the subjects of these interviews, like kind of like over the course of their lives, and like he kind of traces like the developments of like particular, just sort of like random subjects in history, as opposed to like, the sort of the classical approach to history, which is like telling history through like the big characters, a consistent theme he follows is of individuals trying to change the world, and like that endeavor being sort of futile, I guess. That's kind of what besides what you said, kind of what it's a little bit incoherent, I think, what he was kind of aiming for with the film. Definitely by the end, too, it was like kind of muddy, and there was some, I don't know, kind of just like unusual points that he makes, like that Cambridge Analytica didn't really influence the election, and like that Russia isn't really like, doesn't have bad motives or something. Like he makes some kind of bizarre claims towards the end of the film, but it's yeah.
It would be, I think we should get into all of those claims he makes and just dive into them a bit later. But to go back to what you were saying originally, I also agree with you. It's like it was a really interesting approach to the medium of documentary filmmaking.
Yeah.
And this was actually my first introduction to Adam Curtis. So it was kind of like no context Adam Curtis. And I found it to be really jarring, as both a sort of like formally and in terms of the narrator, very much a BBC documentary. But then in terms of how it was like so much found footage, it was kind of radical. So yeah, I think that the pandemic theme of it is a really interesting one.
Yeah, it's definitely a good film for the pandemic. I also think that it almost functions like a audiobook or a podcast, though, where you can, listen to it without the visuals, which I think is kind of an effective use of the medium as well. Although I do think that like the archival footage brings a certain amount of what would you say, like interpersonal or intimacy with like the subjects, because you're not just charm too, but I think to pick up on another thing you said, Paul, it is definitely a story about like what's going on in like individual people's heads. It's very emotional, but ultimately many of the characters we follow are failed revolutionaries. We see the figure of these 1968 revolutionaries, Michael Dreyfus and a number of Black Panthers, Mao Zedong's wife of the Gang of Four. Her name escapes me right now, but basically a number of these figures are like compelled to change the world and, basically find that old systems of power reinstantiate themselves in ways that, are unexpected. And I guess I was left, if I was going to make one critique of the film, and it would maybe be that these figures, while they didn't change the world completely in the ways that they anticipated or desired, they didn't take those ideas to completion, but I think nonetheless a lot of their ideas in like partial or mutated zombie forms did come to influence the rest of like the development of culture. If you see like, for instance, the transition from 1950s, 1960s picket fence America to now with like basically a fairly radical counterculture and a form of like social liberalism where there is like more freedom to express one's desire, albeit in very limited and commercial ways. That is something that I think
it was almost like a scientific documentary in that way. It was almost like coming at it from a social science edge, where it was presenting this story and this sort of like evidence of these individuals, but making no like wider claims in terms of like what they achieved. Like I feel like it was sort of like, from A to B, they did this and it failed, and that affected these people, without saying like, we can deduce that this has also impacted other parts of the world. So in that way, it was just sort of like veering away from being like more, I don't know, like artistic. For lack of a better word.
I was thinking of the exact same thing. I thought that the perfect description of like this and other of like Adam Curtis's work is kind of like Planet Earth for like social scientists, where it like kind of like ushers in.
It is a lot like, well, his voice is totally Planet Earth.
Yeah, it might just be like my perspective as an American, like every British person like speaking from authority just like sounds like David Attenborough or something, but like you do just like, I mean, I'm not going to say that I knew like almost everything in the film, but like I was at least familiar enough with like these stories or whatever that like listening to it with like the montage and his like voice kind of engendered like a feeling of like when you're watching like Planet Earth and you're like seeing like, oh wow, like it's fascinating. Like I guess I did know that a bee pollinated, but it's so cool to like see it expressed so, with such flourish and whatever. So it's
it was really interesting. It was like alien vantage point or something. Like, oh, this.
Yeah,
like...
well, totally. And in the same way as Planet Earth, he kind of like paints this ecosystem. He wants to tie like psychology in with like just general developments, like political and socioeconomic developments, as well as the individual. So in a way, I mean, I think like he's kind of coming at it from like almost this Nietzschean perspective of like a genealogical approach to say like, look, all of these things were kind of happening in the same time, and then like throughout different disciplines in the West, there was this rampant individualism, both like at the level of the state, at the level of the economy, and at the level of like psychology and what people were talking about as it relates to like the human experience. Because he also gets into not only like failed revolutionaries, but people like Julia Grant, who was this transgender activist in the UK who I think had like the first like mainstream or like documented like corrective surgery.
Yeah, reassignment surgery.
Yeah, corrective reassignment surgery in the late 70s, I believe. So he touches on a lot of these kind of just different like disciplines and like fields of study and tries to bring them all together just to kind of paint this really broad picture of individualism in the West and collectivism in the East, and kind of how both have run their course towards the present moment. And he literally like the documentary, I think, like has footage from like 2 weeks ago, which is like from its publication, like 2 weeks from its publication, which is pretty fucking insane for a documentary. You know, like it literally goes up to like right at the present moment. Like there
Wait,
is
what
some
was the
footage
most
from, like,
recent footage?
there is some footage in the beginning and at the end of like Biden's inauguration.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So he's like literally they must have been making the documentary till like a couple weeks before it's released.
Yeah. Or
fucking
like at least
insane.
adding tons
That's
of clips.
interesting. It's almost like just like
Yeah, yeah.
reacting to the times in terms of how it like approaches like media where it's constantly rolling and to
Yes,
date.
yeah, totally.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because it's like it's sort of pretends to be like he pretends to have like a non-biased touch to the documentary where it's like, oh, this is just like a YouTube stream, or I don't know how you would describe it, but he actually is sort of sculpting this narrative, I think, more than the film like lets off the bat. That was sort of how I felt. I thought it was sort of deceiving in a way where I was like, this isn't like a Shoah, that Holocaust documentary where it's more like freeform, just people's accounts of what happened, not direction by the documentary filmmaker. But this one was just much more like, he's clearly sculpting a narrative. It's not non-biased.
Yeah, these people aren't
means.
speaking for themselves
Yeah.
in large measure. The archival footage where you actually do hear from people is few and far between. And I didn't have a problem with that, especially when it came to the narrative of the developments in the US and the UK, where I have like enough like prior knowledge to kind of like confirm that like, oh yeah, this is like running with like the historical accounts of these places that I feel like are broadly correct. But definitely when you got to the periodization of like the of China and the development of like post Mao, that's just an area that like I'm not like well acquainted with enough to even like debunk or like confirm that what Adam is saying is like entirely correct. So I did feel a little bit uncomfortable in those moments, like taking like hook, line, and sinker his like periodization of like that like history for granted. And I was kind of a little bit wary of that. I also thought that it was funny.
Yeah, I don't think it was like super well researched at points, I'm not gonna lie. Like
Yeah.
I did see multiple YouTube comments saying that I don't think that was true about certain points, and I didn't look into it further, but I was like, oh yeah, that would be a lot to like make these claims.
What I've heard is that a lot of it seems to be related not only to research that he's done in hypernormalization, but a few other films that he's done. Let me pull it up.
Century of the Self is a big one
Yes,
that this
and
is based on heavily.
I think The Living Dead or something is another movie that he did that touches on like specifically a lot of the stuff that he talks about relating to the Middle East. But yeah, I think
I guess that's where my no context Adam Curtis
yeah. Well,
makes me a little bit
it's kind of it's
less
kind of
able to speak on the film.
No. I think it's not even necessary to like be an Adam Curtis pro or to like have never seen it, because it's kind of like a Zizek talk where he really just plays the hits. You know, he has his like go-to, like, we're gonna talk about the rise of individualism, and you know, it's all true as far as it goes, but it definitely leaves you with a bit of a like fatalistic disposition at the end of the day. And Adam Curtis himself has like talked about this in interviews where, like, you know, if you were gonna critique his like movies, like saying that like, well, you don't point like in a direction of like a way out or how to fix things, he's kind of like, yeah, that's the fucking point. Like, the point of all my work is to say that we've completely as a culture run out of an ability to like rationally construct and execute plans for the future, because we like don't believe in like the power, like the redemptive like nature of like humanity. So like, I'm not like, it's interesting because, like, on one hand, Adam Curtis is sitting on high as the narrator, telling you this is the history of the last, like, 40 years, culturally, politically, like, whatever. But then on the other hand, he's like, I'm not outside of this. I have no idea what the fuck we should do. And, like, don't get me twisted if you are coming to me for any sort of, like, answers.
So what were some of the claims he makes at the end in the last film? I don't know if we should just lay it out for the people who haven't seen the film.
Yeah. Well, to me, the really funky parts that kind of are at the end of the film, and it seems like a lot of people are kind of pissed off at the end of the film, but I personally, I want to rewatch it again because it's like 2 hours long. You know, it's like longer than any of the other episodes, which are already like atrociously long. But yeah, so he kind of goes into, I'm not sure if it was in the 5th or last episode, but I was definitely pretty triggered by him talking about the opioid crisis. That like he implies that the opioid crisis got out of control because people were trying to defraud insurance companies by claiming that their injuries were actually worse than they were. And like as a result, they would receive more money from their claims, and they would be like prescribed OxyContin. And then subsequently they would go on OxyContin and be like, oh, this is like dope. Like, I'm just going to stay on this, which is like, I'm sure that was happening, but like, come on, dude. Like, that's a serious stretch. And then the other one was relating to Cambridge Analytica, where, you know, he talks about how like sensationalist media can like captivate people and can like create these dream states, which is a theme he returns to throughout the movie, that in the last like 70 years, we've basically like moved into like what I guess what Baudrillard would call like hyper reality. Like, we've moved into this reality that's curated by like media images rather than like related to anything real. But yeah, on the topic of Cambridge Analytica, he kind of just says that like that people had already decided to vote for Trump, that people had already like decided their political opinions, and Cambridge Analytica didn't like influence the election at all. And I think he's harping mostly on like hysterical liberals, which I agree with, you know, and there is evidence to suggest that like online advertisement doesn't actually fucking work, but I don't think you can doubt like the subconscious effect of like fake news and fake information. Like, yeah, it just seems like that's kind of like a weird mountaintop for him to
well, it's
fight
interesting
on.
within the context of like his view of like human subjectivity, where he's like perfectly happy to kind of frame people as so like zombified by mass media that they kind of like just occupy a false consciousness or a dream state. But then like when it comes to something like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, he can't like realize that like, oh, that's just another extension of that. And like obviously it did. But I think I agree.
The Cambridge Analytica scandal, I mean, I think that there is a case to be made that advertising certainly affects who people will end up voting for. But Cambridge Analytica itself, you know, it might have been an overblown reaction to what happened by the public. I think it certainly like was an overblown reaction. But at the same time, you could say that, you know, the whole scandal, like, aren't you happy that it made people think about how these companies have been using our data and continue to use our data? Yeah, like it was just like the tip of the iceberg, I think. And a really bad reflection on Facebook. But at the end of the day, I think it's better that it happened and not like a sign of people being completely brainwashed by media.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would go against like putting the election of Donald Trump like causally at the foot of Russia or Cambridge Analytica, not because I don't think that they had like any influence whatsoever. I just don't think that they were like the prime like movers.
I mean, it was
whatever.
just negligible if there was an influence, because you would need a lot more votes than whatever Cambridge Analytica achieved.
Right, exactly.
To win an election.
Yeah, and but he didn't like get into that really. You know, he like builds this whole arc with Cambridge Analytica and then ends it being like, no, they didn't really have like a big effect at all, really. Which is just like, all right, okay, fine. Like, thanks for building that up for like 8 episodes. But yeah, so I mean, I think what we're all kind of getting at is kind of what he opens the entire arc with, and it's this quote from David Gabriel that goes like,
it's a David Graeber quote, who was like a famous anthropologist. He like is known for like his book on like debt, and he like was really active in the Occupy Wall Street movement. He's kind of like a hero for like you know, the anarchist, like communist left and like the West or whatever. Rest in peace. He died earlier from COVID. I don't know if I like have the quote exactly right, but it's something like to the effect that we like, the idea is that like we can remake the world. Like the world is something we create, and like it can be remade by us at any time. And that's like, yeah, just as easily. Like it's like we're like held captive to these laws of like economics, these like ways that society is structured like hierarchically. We're like running into ecological devastation, and everyone's like telling us that like, oh, this is just the way like it has to be because of like iron laws of, you know, whatever, like capitalism. But you know, you can just like remake this shit because we made it already. Like there's nothing outside of, you know, our like will to do so. Exactly.
Yeah, and I feel like the film, he kind of is just exploring the fact that while we've produced this world, we've made all the rules, you know, we've made the entire system. Why is it that we couldn't just do it some other way? Like, why is it so difficult to change the world, despite like it being completely artificial, and we've made it this way for some reason, you know, like despite that, why can't we just change the world?
Yeah, no, that's like kind of the central like quandary of the film. And it's like about as much as anything like that question of like powerlessness. And I think that like lurking beneath the film is definitely the like idea, and it could have a longer history than Adam Curtis even draws out, but it's the failure of like, you know, the radical elements. I mean, I think what's the analogy or the anecdotes that Adam Curtis draws out most sharply is the radicals of West Germany after the division of, you know, Germany into the Soviet side of it and like the Western side. These like people who had the RAF, who like feel like fascism has essentially been like maintained in like the contemporary like corporate takeover of the world through neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. And like then through their support of like the Palestinians, they see like a retrenchment of like anti-Semitism, and like they are revealed to like be able to commit like the same acts of violence towards like people that they like disavowed, and then it's like, oh, we realize we can't like fucking like change the world at all.
Yeah, I think his whole argument reminded me a lot of that, like, one writer, Jody Dean, who writes about sort of the circulation of power and the inability for you to make actual change while working from within the system. Like, you'll always, I mean, yeah. I think we should do an episode on her anyways, but yeah, there's definitely a sort of like sense of just like, yeah, futility when it comes to trying to like make change within the system that just seems to absorb everything like all the time. I guess it relates to Mark Fisher too in the conversation we had.
Yeah, and on that note, he kind of ends the film quoting this psychologist who wrote this open letter towards like the whole psychological community, which had basically reinforced the notion that like human beings are irrational and unpredictable, and they don't even have control over their own like consciousness. Like they're driven by like unconscious desires and all this stuff. And yeah, the psychologist just basically like writes this letter to the whole like scientific community, basically like calling for psychologists to get their shit together, because so many of the like very famous psychological experiments like the Stanford prison trial can't be like replicated. Like the results are always radically different, or like never like the tests themselves never can really get off the feet in the same way as like the original tests can. And these scientific experiments, these psychological experiments, are incredibly influential to policymakers. So he kind of ends the film bringing up this open letter, basically because so much of our psychology right now is driven by this this understanding that people can't change the world, that they can't change their material conditions, and that the problems of mental illness are within the individual and they're not related to society or society's problems.
Yeah, I really liked that kind of history where it starts with some of the original philosophers behind kind of analytic, logical positivism, where they like really reduce like human thinking to like a binary form, and then like exclude any sort of like ulterior or like environmental causes, to the point where it's like, it's not just the individual, it's literally just like the fucking brain, where it's like you can change the like chemistry within the brain, and like that's like sufficient to, you know, ail social like or like psychological illnesses.
And he connects that to the rise of pharmaceuticals. Like I feel like that is the sort of like genealogy that he's trying to form, is that there's this rise and there's this philosophical and scientific belief about mankind that kind of like leads to this rise of pharmaceuticals, which are just like, we just need to change the chemistry in people's minds and everything will be fine, you know?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, he deals, I mean, dealing with these topics, you have pharmaceuticals, you have like, you know, Cambridge Analytica, it's just like, he uses like all these sort of like buzz terms, I think, in this way that kind of like put me off, honestly, when it's all stuck into like one docuseries.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that it's a super like dense and ambitious work, and so there is like a kind of like scant like use of like buzz terms, and like there's like the 20 seconds on the Sackler family or whatever. And so like that definitely is like, it could be seen, if you like had a more critical eye of it, is like you need to flesh some of these ideas out if you're actually going to paint like a grand narrative the way you're trying to do.
Yeah, it's definitely a fucking grand narrative.
Yeah, I think it just comes off as like incoherent when you're not really fleshing some of these ideas out.
One thing that stood out to me that was fucking hilarious was that Eldridge Cleaver like one-piece suit for revolutionaries. Did you guys see that part?
Okay, yeah. So it's so funny. It was like their main thing was that they had like a zipper like at the front or like a pouch, and like the idea was like to like free the penis or whatever. Yeah, he did those like Black Panthers dirty with like their like end things. It's like, look, then they became like fucking clowns afterwards. It's like, come on, dude, like.
Well, it was really cool that Tupac.
And then he was like, and then there's like that other like dude who was like the revolutionary in England, like Michael X, and he's like, yeah, then he just wanted to become like a weed farmer and killed his girlfriend, and it's like, yeah, I mean, it's definitely facts, but there's probably like other stories you could highlight.
Or it would be like you could focus on that for 2 hours alone. So it is like, it's like you could give us all sides of that story in kind of an interesting way, but instead you're just like, yeah, this is all I have to say about that, period. Dot. I don't know.
Yeah.
It is an interesting question about like what the value is of bringing in this like grand narrative as opposed to just like doing one documentary like about whatever. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think I appreciate the like ambition of the film, even if it's like not like totally successful in like its treatment of like every one of the like subtopics, because, well, I mean, that's basically like the distinction here, is that like at times we get like a straight up like, here are the economic policies, here's how like they impacted like the society on a meta level. But then with this documentary, what makes it unique is that he's trying to say like, okay, my past documentaries have like not been as intimate as this. Instead, let's like focus on like individual people's lives. But I think the problem is that he like maybe takes the same like approach that he does to like macro things, where it kind of feels like he's using these people's lives as like
props.
vehicles.
Yeah,
as props,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
As props.
Which I think goes back to his like essential like, you know, and it's interesting that like he doesn't like, he has like at various times like critique like Marxism and like the legacy of Marx for being too kind of operational in its view of history and its treatment of like humans, but really like he has a very like kind of like false consciousness utilitarian view of humans as like instruments of history in the way that he like treats the stories of their lives. So yeah, I think that was a struggle throughout the film, feeling like, well, I'm not actually getting enough to like understand these people.
Yeah.
You know.
No, completely agree. One story that I really liked that I was talking to you guys about before was the one about Abu Zabeda, who, for those of you who don't know, is like a Palestinian national who was captured in Pakistan in 2002 for his connection to Al-Qaeda. And he's currently being held in Gitmo. But in the movie, they explore how he was born in Saudi Arabia, became radicalized because he felt disillusioned with the way that like Saudi Arabia was moving towards Western values and was kind of like losing its charm and losing its heart. So he basically becomes like a lieutenant at this like jihadist training camp, and he pens this diary that's to be read by himself in the year 2000. And in it, he kind of just details his PTSD and his memory loss following this like East African embassy attack. It's a super trippy and kind of touching point of the movie. He also kind of talks about his disillusionment with bin Laden and sort of this just like precursor like movement of like ISIS and like extreme radicalism and like sort of just like the failure of the values of the revolution. And he was like super like into like Rambo and like I think like this Lady in Red song, just these like really weird like niche things in Western culture. And yeah, so, and he has like multiple personality disorders. You should check out his diary if you can, because it's a super bizarre and like moving piece of work of just like this really broken individual. And when they captured him, they like shot him in the testicles, like shot him in the leg, like just, you know, filled this guy with bullets. And then he survived. and was like held in like a prison for like 5 years before like anybody knew where he was. And then he was transferred to Guantanamo Bay, where like within a single month he was waterboarded like 80 times, and they would put him in like a dog cage to like the point where like his muscle contractions would be like so fucking horrible, and like his screams so loud that they like finally would release him. And they eventually like destroyed all of the evidence that like detailed his extensive and like fucking insane torture.
Well, yeah, I will say that one thing that's cool about the documentary is that in moments like that, it really doesn't like pull any punches about the like exact extent of the terror and crisis and like brutal inhumanity, you know, when it's talking about, you know, how the function of like laws in the war on terror like create you know, legal loopholes and like exceptions that like cast you outside of citizenship or any like fundamental rights and you know, privileges under the Geneva Convention, and how these people are like disappeared. I mean, I think that in combination with like some of the you know, talk about like ecological destruction and like terrorism by the, you know, United States domestic and international like military and police against like post-colonial subjects and like, you know, Black Americans in the U.S. It's definitely, you know, for the normies out there, it could be a bit of a clear pill or something. I don't know. I'd be curious like how you guys feel like if you were unfamiliar with like this history. I'm not sure that, I mean, I don't know how many people are, like what your experience would be like.
Well, like I definitely am like familiar with like British colonialism and the brutal history of that. But in terms of what Adam Curtis brings to the table, like stories about I'm gonna mispronounce it, Jiang Qing, Mao's wife. Yeah, like in terms of stories, or about Michael X.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with those.
I really wasn't. I was passingly familiar with those people. And
yeah, Mao's wife is the most insane arc, I think, in the whole movie, and I was completely unfamiliar with it. It is just insane. Just her like basically like 30-year revenge plot against this girl who like stole her like Chinese Hollywood career. Like it's fucking bad shit.
Yeah, and then how she tries to like kill herself by like slamming her head against the wall, and then they have to like put pillows on the wall. I was like, damn, that's hardcore.
She's kind of a boss, really. Like her and Tupac's mother are like the bosses of the film, because like Tupac's mother defends herself against basically this like complete like government plot that totally like set up the Panthers, and she defends herself in court and fucking wins, just like a total badass, and like everybody else was like lawyered up and lost.
That was honestly the most hopeful point in the entire film, that like
I almost cried.
Yeah, that was a very moving part, and he's like, and this can show that we can stand up to the power structure.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's interesting. I mean, the documentary is tight in the way that it's bringing this, like, these alternative people in. Sorry, I'm still I'm processing out loud, but I like, especially in the wake of all of these restrictions in the UK in the education system, which just passed a measure which makes it so that kids can't read anything that would like incite communism or socialism. I mean, to have something like Adam Curtis's documentary like on the BBC, I think is totally like the antithesis of that, and that's like super important.
That's heavy.
You know?
Yeah, it's super heavy. I mean, it's so interesting though. It's like I was having like a kind of like, you know, in processing this, like as you're saying in real time, I was like having like a war in my head of like both being like, fuck yeah, this is like on the BBC. Like if like, you know, everyone saw this, like maybe that would be like, you know, something important or interesting if like more people were aware of this history. But then on the other hand, I was like, wait, this is on the BBC. So like this essentially like has no fucking like revolutionary like power or anything. I don't know. It's like if it's distributed by like state media, it's like, okay, so even like the people in like the head of like this like public broadcaster who like are in the fucking bag of the, reactionary Tory government have like greenlit this project.
I just have this like fundamental like mistrust of mainstream media. So I'm like, like what is he trying to pull on me right now?
Yeah. and kind of on the point that I think you were talking about earlier, Dylan, about was I familiar with a lot of this history? He has another movie, I believe it's called The Living Dead, where he kind of like takes on the topic of how politicians will like use not only misinformation, but they'll also use like people's memory to kind of like get like policies across. And watching this reminded me so much of like just how short term my memory is, just like how quick I am to like forget about like everything that happened under Obama and under the Bush administration and shit. But I remember when there's a part in the movie where he talks about there's this wave of liberal reforms that were happening kind of in the early, like 2010, I believe, in China, where there is this kind of like Justin Trudeau-esque figure that became popular in Beijing, I believe, and was trying to institute all these reforms. And then it turned out that he's like massively corrupt and like embezzling all this money, at least if you believe the Chinese Communist Party's narrative. I'm amazed what I know, but I don't really consciously remember a lot. And I feel like that's maybe possibly a point of what he's kind of trying to get at in this film that he's also explored at in other films, is like we're living through crazy times, and we've been living through crazy times for like the last 70 fucking years,
Yeah. I think that's a huge thing about like when he's talking about the century of the self, or like the like development of this like rampant individualism alongside consumer cultures, that it's like super blind to like the idea that like who you are is like what you remember. It's like a historical fact, and it's based on your like placement within like power hierarchies or whatever. So I think that like this idea of memory is like extremely important and like runs through the film. And oftentimes I think it's equated with like how people act like subconsciously, where a big theme is like fear and anger, and like it being unleashed in moments of revolutionary violence, where like revolutionaries like didn't know it was there, or didn't know that that's like what they were releasing. But like it's because people like aren't aware of like this like history or this like embedded memory like within them that's kind of like on the verge of peeking out.
Yeah. What is like more about memory than creating an archive, which is essentially what he's doing, right? He's creating, he's raising the question like pretty explicitly with the Cambridge Analytica thing of like, why are we remembering this when we could be remembering this? Or like, all of this information is fucking excluded.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is a good point. I didn't think of it that way. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a super archival piece, or it's like playing with the idea of like an archive. I thought another thing that was interesting about it, maybe just to like end on something that like we probably can like speak about in more, I don't know, like concrete terms than a lot of the other things, is the characterization of American culture, where he, like Adam Curtis, paints through the Operation Mindfuck in Playboy magazine that was going on, where they were trying to, the names escape me, but there's these two figures who, they work for Playboy magazine. They're like whatever, like somewhat radical, and they're really pissed about conspiracy theories. So they say like, we're going to do this thing called Operation Mindfuck, where we're going to plant these stories about the Illuminati that are so like insanely conspiratorial that they'll get like the American public to disavow all of their beliefs in conspiracy, so that they can focus on like what's actually like really going on, which is like whatever, like rampant inequality, like racism, like whatever. And
totally backfires.
yeah, it totally fucking backfires to the extent that like the homie who like initially conceives of the project realizes that like, oh, like wait, maybe I was like actually being convinced by the CIA to like even do Operation Mindfuck. But yeah, that's just to say that like there's like definitely a focus in this film and its characterization of like America and Americans, that like paranoia is like the chief kind of psychological ailment of like this country and its people. And he says that it's like it's based on the fact that people who immigrated to America came from Europe and they were deeply suspicious and fearful of like the old power that they escaped from. And that like even though they were like in a new world or whatever, like new world in quotes, whatever, but they still had the fear of like, oh, like those old powers are like they're taking over the government, like Washington's still like whatever in charge by like the Illuminati. So I wondered what you guys thought of that. Like, I mean, it definitely goes to fake news and Alex Jones. It's all very like buzzy right now, but do you guys feel paranoid? Do you guys feel like some paranoid motherfuckers?
I thought it was funny though, like the Illuminati thing has just this immediate parallel to like Pizzagate, which was like in created for the exact same reason, and then now has like pretty much just fucking backfired. Like everybody believes that there's like this cabal of fucking pedophiles, you know, like Bill Clinton has a fucking 9-year-old on a leash or something.
Wait, so you're saying you don't believe in the Lolita Express, dude? I don't know. I believe that shit. I don't believe full Pizzagate, but I deadass do believe in that like Epstein shit. So maybe
the CIA
I'm proving
put that in my mind. Yeah, maybe the CIA put that in my mind. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, as far as suspicion and whatnot, I mean, there's definitely some point. Particularly, it's so hard in the modern day because shit has been so fucking watered down, and like the fucking power systems are so efficient at this point you can barely even see them. It's really difficult because he uses like the Red Scare and like the quote unquote like yellow scare of like China in like the 50s and 60s as this like prime example of paranoia, you know, and it was just totally paranoia for no reason. Like China was not fucking invading us, didn't even have the power to do that. Like the communists were nowhere near like a fucking revolution, you know, probably because people were more, you know, obsessed with paranoia than they were with fucking pursuing their own liberation. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's definitely some truth to that. I don't personally, do I feel that? No. But I mean, I think that a lot of Americans do, and it's precisely because, you know, there's a media climate that sort of suggests it. You know, it's following the Cold War and immediately switched to the Middle East, and now we're switching. It was like fucking Russia like 4 years ago, and I think people are getting better at sort of like detecting that these are just like scare tactics, you know, and I don't think people are as gullible, but maybe that's just hopeful fucking rhetoric. I don't know. Because now, like, we're switching from fucking Russia as the bad guy that's stealing the elections to, like, China is about to invade us or something.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of fear-mongering in the media in the U.S. So I definitely think there's a point there in terms of, like, yeah, like, U.S. people are super paranoid. And, you know, I think, you know, on one hand, people from outside of the country are like, what the fuck is happening there? Like, are y'all okay? And then on the other hand, people are just like, oh, they're all just paranoid. So I don't know. I think I think that the way we look to the rest of the world is at the very least just fucking crazy.
Yeah.
And that's like
America,
indisputable.
you okay, bro?
Whether it's paranoid or whether it's like we are actually in danger. I think that people think that it's not a good situation, which it isn't.
Well, I think our paranoia has ironically like created its own vice, you know, like by being paranoid and like invading all these fucking countries because there's, you know, like supposed imminent threats, be it by, you know, Islamic extremism or socialism, that we've actually just created like an entire world population which fucking hates us and actually does want revenge. It's like, I don't think the Middle East would like think so poorly of America had we not been like fucking with their politics since the 70s, and the same goes with like South American countries. So, like, I think ironically our paranoia has created the very thing that we've been fighting and that we've been fucking petrified from.
Yeah, I think that's definitely in the first, like, Adam Curtis part of this, the first part of the documentary, like, definitely talks about that with the British Empire as well. I mean, I'd just like to leave it on like one positive note, though. I think that like watching the Adam Curtis documentary is definitely something that like everyone should like do just to like be familiar with these
absolutely.
like historical touchstones. But I think that like especially with the way like he leaves it and like the overall maybe like teleology of like the documentary is kind of like pointing towards this like closed system that like is constantly encircling those who would try to like countervene it or like subvert it. But I think that there definitely shouldn't be this tendency to like think that there's some sort of like end of history. Like the one thing that's like certain is that things will change. Yeah. For instance, you already see in the United States like kind of the like tethering out or the withering out of ideas of like neoliberal economics and like individualism, like, and libertarianism within like the state. Like I think that you definitely see with the election of like Donald Trump and the rise of whatever the like social democratic socialist, like without the presence of actually existing socialism, this like rampant devotion to individualism and neoliberalism, at least amongst the voting public, has like, I think at least reached its pinnacle and is probably on the way down. So some shit is gonna fucking change. It might get worse, it might get better, but I don't think that we're just like in a like cyclical
I
time
agree
period.
with that hopeful note.
Oh, absolutely.
And when it comes to regulation in terms of like tech companies and scandals like Cambridge Analytica, you see policies trying to keep up with how quickly these companies are changing and how quickly they're becoming more and more intertwined with the government. And so I think that, like Dylan said, like there's a really like positive note to end on for sure.
Yeah, and he did. He's done an interview posthumously after the release of the film where he goes into like pretty explicitly. I'm pretty sure he like actually says it like this. He's like, there is a crisis happening right now, and the tech companies are doing absolutely fucking nothing about it and are probably making the problem worse. I know, but it is changing. I mean, it's like there's so much media coming out, and there's so much, all the more reason why you should go watch the film and do your own research and develop your own opinion. On the Adam Curtis Reddit page, there's a lot of good information. They like basically give all the sources for the film, so you can kind of get your own opinion. But the reality is that things are changing, and a lot of it has to do with just like the education and the dissemination of information like this.
I have to finish the last 10 minutes of the film.